Welcome to Board Game Science. I'm your host, Dr. Ransom Poythress, and I'm really excited to spotlight with you our very first game in the series, Pandemic, which probably comes as no surprise to most people. So Pandemic was designed by Matt Leacock, and it took him about 3 years to find a publisher for it. In the end, Z-Man Games picked it up, and it was published in its first edition in 2008. Since then, it's sold about 2 million copies, with a second edition that came out in 2013, and it spawned a variety of expansions and even a few legacy editions. So it's a fully cooperative game, and so I'm going to spend the next few minutes talking about how the game works and whether or not you can actually save humanity by playing this game. So although Pandemic can be played with anywhere from 2 to 4 players, I've actually set it up here for just a standard 3-player game. And the object of the game is for players to work cooperatively to research cures for the 4 different diseases plaguing the planet, represented here by the 4 different colored blocks: yellow, blue, black, and red. On your turn, a player can take 4 actions. The list of all available actions are helpfully listed on these information cards. Actions usually consist of a combination of moving around the board, removing disease cubes, establishing research stations, and finding cures. Each player also has a specific role, which grants them special abilities to help the team. There are 7 possible roles, which can either be selected purposefully ahead of time or divvied up randomly. To find a cure for one of the diseases, a player must turn in 5 cards of the same color. Now, right now I don't have 5 cards, so how do I get more? Well, at the end of your turn, you draw 2 more cards from the player card pile. And there are certain other actions that allow you to acquire cards from other players as well. That sounds simple, right? Well, not quite. At the end of every player turn, new cards are drawn from the infection deck. And the number of cards drawn from that deck is determined by the infection rate. New disease cubes are then placed on the board to match the cities that are drawn from the infection deck. What's more, certain rare epidemic cards might be drawn from the player's deck at the end of a player's turn. These increase infection rate, add a lot more disease cubes, increase the likelihood of something called outbreaks, and generally cause pandemonium. There are a few more intricacies that I've overlooked here for the sake of time, but that's basically it. Players keep taking turns until you either find all 4 cures and save humanity, or are overwhelmed by the plagues and several possible loss conditions. Have fun! So now that you know a little bit about how the game is played, let's talk a little bit about the inspiration and some of the science behind it. So I had a few questions about it, and I decided to go straight to the source. So I called the designer, Matt Leacock, and he was kind and generous enough to offer me a little bit of his time and answer a few of my questions. And I may or may not have had a bit of a fanboy moment. So I asked him a little bit about kind of the inspiration for the game and how some of the aspects of it were designed. So I asked him, first of all, how the various cities got here. Why did he pick some cities and not others? So one of the things he said was that it was based on major urban centers, so cities that had the largest population. However, if you only do that in terms of the globe, then most of your cities are going to be congested in, say, like China and Asia and India. And that doesn't make for a really balanced or clean looking board layout. So it was based on major populations, major cities, but also distribution. So he got a fairly even distribution of cities kind of around the board as well. A couple of other little factoids too. He mentioned that the players start off in Atlanta, which is where the CDC is actually located, the Center for Disease Control, which is a real place, as well as Essen, the city here, is kind of a secret little throw-out to gamers, because the city of Essen is where the world's largest board game trade show is held every year, with over 200,000 people in attendance last year. Finally, in the second edition of the game, the city of Toronto was replaced with Montreal because Z-Man Games, the publisher, got bought out by a different publisher who was headquartered in Montreal. So one of the things that Matt said about this was that he wasn't trying to create a game that really taught anything about science. It was mostly designed to be a good game, to be fun for people and to play well. Nonetheless, there are several aspects of the game that actually do a really good job of reflecting, I think, some of the realities of disease and what's going on. So let's talk for a second about those. First of all, the board game requires that you adopt both short-term and long-term strategies in order to be able to successfully win the game. So in the short term, you have to be kind of removing some of these infectious cubes. If you just ignore them, they'll take over and you'll lose the game. But if you just try and do that, you also won't succeed. You need to focus on some long-term goals too in order to cure the diseases, which is the actual goal of the game. So in real life, in a real pandemic, there are also short-term and long-term goals, right? In the short term, you have to be taking care of people who get sick. And then in the long term, you have to be thinking about developing cures or like a vaccine or kind of more stable long-term treatments. In addition to that, what I really like about this game is the degree of unpredictability. And I think that does it quite well reflects some of the unpredictability that we face in our current situation. So in the board game, you never really know which city you're going to flip when you flip over the infectious city cards. So you never really know what's going to happen. You never really know what's going to pop up. You never really know where the next hotspot is going to be. And I think we've all discovered that that's sort of similar to the reality of the situation as well. There's a lot of unpredictability with disease and kind of where things are going to center, and that creates a lot of tension and anxiety as well. However, there is a degree of predictability with this game too, on the flip side, which I think doesn't quite catch what's really going on. So with the board game, you know at the end of every turn, you're going to flip over a certain number of tiles, and a certain number of cubes are going to go out. And that's a very predictable number and a very predictable amount. Whereas in reality, diseases don't exactly grow in a very predictable schedule, right? There's exponential growth and decline, and it's much less predictable in that sense than the board game is. But then again, you want to develop a board game that can be won by 3 or 4 people, and it's designed by a creator, in this case Matt Leacock, as opposed to a disease which kind of is acting on its own in many respects. The other thing that's really nice about this is the cooperation requirement. All the players here have to be working together if you're going to win. If one player decides to go rogue and just kind of do their own thing, it's pretty likely that you're going to fail and lose the game. Similarly, to a certain extent, in the face of a global disease, a lot of cooperation is necessary. So things like genome sharing and that kind of thing. Yes, there's a lot of individual work within countries, and yes, unfortunately, it's very easy for us to get mired down in global politics, but there's still a degree of cooperation which I think makes us kind of come together as a globe in that respect. One of the other things that's quite nice about this board game, and I don't know whether Matt thought about this, is the importance of urban centers. Typically, diseases are going to spread through cities where there's lots of people together, and that's what we've discovered, and that's kind of how the board game is laid out, whether or not that was intentional. Some things, though, that maybe doesn't get quite as right, it's difficult to really incorporate into a game of this size, something that's supposed to be playable in 45 minutes, all the different complex mitigation strategies that are involved. So there's no real way here of talking about things like quarantining and closing borders and the effects that those might have on disease spread. In addition, there's nothing here that really describes the effects of international air travel on disease spread. So that was one of the major ways in which diseases spread, is by people going from place to place using planes. Whereas in the game here, everything is pretty much geographically constrained. The yellow diseases tend to stay in the yellow areas of the board, and the blue diseases in the blue areas of the board, and so on and so forth. Whereas that's not really what's happening in the rest of the world. So all of that be the case, though, it's a pretty fun game, and it does a pretty good job of reflecting some of what's really going on in the world. I hope that's been helpful in terms of being informative and also interesting in terms of describing this game, what it's about, and how it kind of reflects what's going on. And I look forward to sharing with you the next game. Thank you.